Hey there, this is my second video, and the first one did get some positive feedback, so to anyone who subscribed or emailed, I really appreciate it. The idea that there are people out there who might actually want to be notified if I post another video is really encouraging, if for no other reason than just the therapeutic value of being able to speak to an audience that can potentially relate. It's not easy to find people in your immediate vicinity that can identify with a lot of these thoughts and emotions that sort of linger for a long time after being raised the way we were. Just as a side note, speaking of therapy, I've been watching videos of people that go up to carts and sort of interrogate the witnesses, and I can understand how that might be sort of an opportunity to vent and get your frustrations out to those people, but I don't see how you're identifying them as the victims that they are. Like, it's like if I once had the opportunity and the privilege of helping a baby fawn, a baby deer, get untangled from barbed wire where I grew up, and I cannot see how the approach of walking up to someone deeply entangled in that position, just yelling at the deer, "I'm here to help you, I'm going to save you," would do anything other than further entangle it, freak it out, and make it even worse. I mean, you, of all people, should recognize that they're in a state of mind where the world is out to get them and they're victims, and they have a persecution complex, and persecuting them only validates their position, their view of how it is on the outside. So for me, it should be pretty clear that a better approach is to gently coax the fawn out of the mess it got itself into. But you know, who am I to say? Maybe that method really does work in some minds, but I tend to think it's more of more for the persecutor, just sort of a way to release frustration and not really helping anybody, but that's just me. Anyway, in the first video I kind of talked about how if you're in a position where you're feeling conflicted or guilty for even considering sources of information that conflict with your present state of mind, that I was able to kind of get through that period of my life with a few basic principles that applied even if you take the Bible very seriously and literally. So if you didn't see that, that's fine, but if you are viewing this with any apprehension or internal conflict or guilt, I would strongly encourage you to check out that first one before you continue to this one. So I mentioned towards the end of that one that I would talk about my story, and my life story includes, just sort of from a bird's eye view, being raised as a Jehovah's Witness, getting disfellowshipped, getting married at the age of 17, not attending my senior year of high school. Obviously the marriage didn't work, and after that ended, I was homeless for a period of time, and eventually, as I was starting to get on my feet, I lost my first son at 1 year old, and I think that event sort of precipitated the sequence of events that led to me making that first video. I don't think I'm really going to get into any of that in this discussion, but I know, at least for me, it will be helpful at some point to talk about that. The experience of grieving without invoking any supernatural shenanigans. But that, I think, is a topic for another time, because in this one I'm just going to talk about how my story, that, like many others, how I came to the conclusion that I didn't have the truth. So I think it starts with the phrase bloom of youth. It's a phrase you're probably familiar with if you're viewing this. And I don't know if it's just the hall that I was in or if it was written somewhere, but they presented this idea that the bloom of youth was actually in your early 20s, or at least that's when it was officially over, because science has recently discovered that the prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed and fully fused until that age in adults. I mean, it couldn't possibly be just the end of puberty, right? I mean, that's wouldn't make any sense that people who got married very, very early in biblical times would have considered the bloom of youth puberty, or Romeo and Juliet, who were 13, would have referred to the bloom of youth. And technically, in those days, the statistical life expectancy was like you're middle-aged by the time you're 14. But no, of course that's not what they meant, because you shouldn't be dating or making major commitments in marriage until after you're through the bloom of youth, until you're able to think clearly and you're not overrun with emotions and capable of easily being misled by your feelings. That would be a terrible time to make a lifelong commitment like marriage. Well, the fact that they recognize that actually makes it even more sinister that they encourage children as young as I was to make the lifelong commitment to the organization. Because I couldn't have done so with a clear head. Of course I was surging with emotional certainty that I was in the right place and making the right decision. In fact, if you liken it to an actual marriage, it's an even bigger commitment than a real marriage. You think about the consequences for leaving a real marriage. If you don't have any kids, it's totally possible to leave unscathed, and you take your circle of friends with you and your family, and your ex-spouse takes theirs with them, and it ends amicably and you go separate directions. Even some of the worst marriages, it's not likely to cause an existential crisis in your life where you no longer have access to any of your friends, family, or circle of influence. So, in many ways, the decision to get baptized should be taken more seriously than a baptism. And yet they'll encourage people to do that prior to getting through the bloom of youth. Certainly not in their late 20s. That's way too, or early 20s. That's way too late. So, I'm just going to talk about it like it was a marriage for a minute, because I think it's a fitting and appropriate analogy. She was like 100 or so, and I was 12, and it was a very controlling marriage, because she told me that if I ever questioned her or considered leaving, she would take all of my friends and family with her. And I knew it wasn't an idle threat, that she could actually deliver on that promise. In addition to that, she allowed herself the freedom to change her mind completely about very important and instrumental elements of our relationship. But I couldn't waver one bit and change my mind about anything. So, for example, one of the things she used to motivate me to marry her as young as I did was this idea that she was going to be taking some some amazing trip where there's a fountain of youth and we could ride pandas together and just be in harmony and one in bliss with nature and God and everything. And the date that she said she was going on this trip had to be within a few years, because at the time that I married her, she had used this convoluted explanation about a prophecy in Daniel about a time and half a times and a tree getting cut down, and sort of used that in conjunction with Christ telling his followers that their generation would by no means pass away. And she said there could be no other conclusion other than the fact that people who witnessed a certain series of events in 1914 must still be alive at the time that she takes this trip. And if I didn't marry her before the trip came, there was a good chance that I'd be left behind and she would go without me. So it was really, really frustrating when soon after the marriage, she admitted that actually the word generation doesn't mean generation. It means the subsequent generation, but we're gonna continue using that word because these overlapping generations are one and the same. So even though at the time you made this lifelong commitment to me, that group of people was in their 80s or 90s and you knew you had almost no time, she's gonna go ahead and buy herself an extra 20, 30, 40 years. That was one major change that she made, but she has made so many changes throughout the years. At the time, I didn't realize that that whole trip thing was promised many, many times. I wish I had known before I made that commitment. She said it was going to happen in 1975 and 1925 and 1914. Each time, as the day drew closer, she would extend it another 20, 30 years. Still, the fact that she changed so much about so many issues in no sense gave me the freedom to change my mind. Because one thing that remained relatively consistent throughout our relationship was that fact that even if she changes, I can't, and if I do, she's going to take my friends and family with her. By now, she's a very different person than the one that I married. At the time I married her, there was the Revelation book, which I called The Truth. There was the Creation versus Evolution book, which I called The Truth. There was Isaiah's prophecy and Daniel's prophecy, both of which were the truth. Now, not so much. None of those books are in print, and many of the ideas contained in those books are no longer considered true. So one could argue that she's the one who changed and not me. Although the truth is, we both did. Because I was 12, how could I not change into someone else as I became an adult? So, honestly, I think I would rather my daughter, when she reaches the age of 12, get involved in an actual marriage to someone than make a lifelong commitment with lifelong repercussions at that age to an organization, an ever-changing organization. Because even if she were to change her mind 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, it is an immense life-altering ordeal to try to leave with your dignity. So, in my case, soon after I made that lifelong commitment, like literally within a year, I was already having legitimate regrets and had good reason to worry that I had made a mistake. And it started with an earth science class, which I wasn't really, had it been some terrible satanic belief class, like now we're going to study evolution or something super horrible like that, I probably would have had the blinders high enough to where nothing really would have gotten through to me. But since it was such an innocuous topic that we were studying, such an innocent thing, I really did retain and onboard the material in this class. And the class was how to use a microscope. And one of the things that we were investigating under the lens of the microscope was a mosquito, which turns out is a pretty cool thing to use a microscope on if it's the right kind, because contained within what you would otherwise think is just a hair-thin tube on the face of a mosquito is a whole set of tools, and tools that are really well designed to perform specific tasks. And so, for example, inside of that tube there is tucked away a little sawing device and a little needle inside the tube that injects some sort of numbing agent to help the mosquito avoid detection while it's sucking your blood. And by the time you realize it was there, it's gone, and then your skin gets irritated. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of little tools inside of this syringe on the end of the mosquito's face. And it occurred to me that this thing appears to be really well designed to do some terrible stuff, because this couldn't be designed by the same God who allows children to die because he can rejecting blood transfusions, because blood is such a sacred element to him. So it's really just a simple question. I know for a fact that mosquitoes exist. I can see them with my own eyes, and I feel them every day in the part of the world I grew up in. So you can't deny their existence. And now there's also no denying that it's a really sophisticated, well-designed creature. And growing up as a witness, your understanding of natural selection is that, like, I actually recently had a wake left at my door, and in the very back of it, they're talking about the sophistication and shape of a seashell, and how they end it on the very back page with the question, was it designed or did it evolve? Well, I now know it's a false dichotomy, because even if it did evolve, it is still designed. It's just the question is, was it designed by a person or was it designed by a process? And that was the question that was sitting under my microscope about the mosquito. Either this sophisticated tool set came about under the supervision of a creator, or it did so independent of a creator. And what I knew about the creator could not line up with this mosquito, because not only do mosquitoes go around surviving by sucking blood, but they're also responsible for more human deaths than any other species on Earth, including other humans. So you can't exactly blame free will for this horrendous little creature that goes around destroying more lives than anything else. So the few occasions where this teacher had touched on evolution, I tried to shoot her down. I was the know-it-all intelligent design kid in the back of class who would say things like, if we were looking at the skull of Lucy, I would say, well, how do we know that that's not just some deformed human? Or when we were looking at the comparative anatomy between a human hand and a whale's flippers and a bat's wing, and how they're all basically the same bone structure, just modified, I would say, raise my hand and say, well, obviously our creator is very efficient, and similar designs, it's just, he's using that, why fix what's not broken? But the mosquito couldn't really be answered in that way. It kind of put me on my heels. And because the teacher had such a calm and honest approach, And I think this relates to the whole deer caught in the barbed wire thing. I was comfortable asking her because when I mentioned the thing about Lucy and I mentioned the thing about the comparative anatomy, her answer was pretty much the same. And she said, that's an excellent question. She didn't appeal to authority of experts and say, oh, well, they just know that. She told me, you shouldn't take it on face value that it's not just some deformed human skull. You should look to see if they have any evidence of the claims they're making, and that's how you will know. You should be skeptical even of the best scientist in the world. Let the evidence convince you. So I figured she'd have a similar answer about the mosquito, but I just wanted to know her opinion. And I asked, why did God create something like this? What do you think? And her answer was, well, I don't think God directly created the species on Earth. I think a mosquito very likely is a descendant of a species that sucked nectar. And a more readily available, less competitive food source was blood. And it eventually, whatever was able to do that, survived better than various nectar ancestors. And that explanation actually sort of rang true to me, because at least then I could say, well, it started off in the Garden of Eden. But then I would have to admit that life can change fairly radically, which is basically admitting to evolution. So it didn't sit very well with me that, God destroyed all of the violent animals and human beings 4,500 years ago in a global flood, and since then there's this life-destroying insect flying around with these sophisticated tools set on its face. And I didn't take her word for it, but I kind of prayed about it and thought about it, and the question couldn't be satiated. It wouldn't subside, because on an almost daily basis I was interacting with these stupid insects that I couldn't figure out why on earth a loving creator would make them. I brought it up to some people in my family, and they kind of just laughed it off. It seems like such an unimportant detail. But it's not unimportant. It kills more humans than anything else. Eventually, out in service, I brought it up to an elder, and his response was not to try to talk about the fall of mankind and biology or anything like that. Instead, he went straight to a scripture about the dangers of a man who doubts being like a guy tossed around at sea. Basically kind of a warning shot to not think about questions like that. That it is basically immoral to raise questions that might cause you to doubt the storyline in the Bible. So I happen to know that within a month or so the CEO was coming to visit, and I figured if anybody's going to help me with this, it's going to be the circuit overseer. Keep in mind, I was very devout at this time. I had a couple of Bible studies. I was a good student. I was, on honor roll consistently. And the Bible studies were not like just excuses to hang out with worldly kids. They were legitimately and making progress. But I figured if I was going to address this with the CEO, I better know what I'm talking about. So I really dug in. I learned everything about mosquitoes. Did you know, for example, that a mosquito hunts you down by tracking CO2 or whatever air you're emitting when you breathe? And the reason for that is breath is a sign of a respiratory system, which is a sign of a source of blood. But in looking into the mosquito, it occurred to me that this is just one example of a virtually infinite number of examples in nature of life forms that not only contradict the narrative of a loving creator, but seem to indicate a biological arms race, where everything is either designed to kill, avoid being killed, and to reproduce, or to do all three of those. Camouflage and fangs and venom and poison and claws and all kinds of creative ways to either harm other life forms or avoid being harmed by them. That the natural world doesn't really line up with the idea that this is all made just for us. There is no living thing that simply benefits humankind for its own sake. You think, if you're not thinking very hard, you think, well, bees make honey for us and trees make fruit for us. And you never stop and recognize that bees fight to the death to protect their honey and would kill you if you're unarmed, if you don't have clothing or whatever. Nothing is just there for us. Fruit has found that, trees have found that the best way to spread their seeds over great distances is for other animals to take the fruit and carry it and poop it out or drop it or whatever. Some plants disguise their fruit to smell and look like poop so that dung beetles will take it and bury it. It's not really a gift to the dung beetle so much as it is propagation of its own genes. And the destructive, violent behavior and nature of all of the natural world was really starting to occur to me. And so when I approached the CEO, I still focused on mosquitoes because these are the things that I had fully done a prodigy search project on back when the internet was dial-up. And his answer was, I guess, a little better than the elders, but it still didn't address the fundamental concern. All he said was, God still loves you. Again, he turned it into me having problems and doubts, and it was some sort of moral failure on my part. But God forgives me for that moral failure, and I'll get past this with prayer. And I took that seriously, and I prayed, and then I thought, I should really try and re-indoctrinate myself, not in those words, but make it real to yourself by studying deeper into the organization's material, which is exactly what I did. So one of my Bible studies, he was like kind of a loner who was bald and had a trench coat, and this is before Columbine and all of the rash of shootings, but at the time you kind of picture that kind of person as a kind that you don't want to get on the bad side of. But in our study, he was very sincere and intelligent and probably grateful just to have someone treat him like he wasn't an outcast. But the thing is, his dad was a non-believer, and his mom was like something crazy, like a Seventh-day Adventist or evangelical or something, and they were divorced. So he had told me that he's kind of going back and forth between these two ideologies, while physically going back and forth between these two places. And I thought, you know what, I'm part of an organization that has all the answers, so I can help you with that. So together we should study this book, because I'm really curious about all of the arguments that I need to onboard to discredit evolution. So we'll study the creation versus evolution book. And that was the book that really initiated my whole coming to realize that the organization is not what I thought it was. And that's because at a certain point in that book, there is a example, it happens to be one of the most famous examples of quote mining. Quote mining is, for those of you who don't know, It's when you take a quote from some other author and take it completely out of context so that it means something completely different, oftentimes completely opposite of what the author was intended to say. So there's tons of examples of that in the creation book, but it only took one for me to realize what was happening. So like an example of a quote mine would be if I said something like, I hate it when people use God's name in vain. And then somebody else comes along, lifts that sentence, but removes the two words in vain, and instead quotes me as saying, this guy says, quote, I hate it when people use God's name, ... end of quote. What a monster. He hates it when people use God's name. And it is especially sinister if you know your audience is only going to be listening to your version of that without looking at it in its original context. And one of the most famous examples of that happening throughout all of creationist literature happens to also be contained within the Life, How Did It Get Here creation book. And it is a sentence that Darwin used in The Origin of Species, and the sentence is something like, I freely confess it seems absurd to the highest degree that something as sophisticated as the human eye could have come about through natural processes or natural selection. Something like that is the quote. But when Darwin said that, he was starting off what was going to be paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of explaining how he thinks it may have occurred. So really all he was doing is saying, here's objection I think reasonable people might have to this idea, and here's how I think it could be overcome, listing examples like crustaceans with far more primitive light-sensitive cells on their face that could eventually, through a series of events, generation after generation, hone in on a really well-designed eye. The thing is, after we got through that chapter, the following day, this student came to school with a Xerox copy of that quote in its original context from The Origin of Species that his dad had apparently been following along in our Bible study. And there I had it in black and white in front of me, an example of the authors of the creation book literally deceiving their audience on purpose. Because there's no way you would see that quote and think that his intention was to say, you know what, my whole idea is absurd. That doesn't even make sense on its face, that he would go through all the trouble of publishing this book and associating his name with it, and then contained in that book is a statement, I think this is absurd. But more importantly, at that point, it didn't even matter to me where I stood on the question of creation or evolution. It was just, now I know that even the source that I thought was always looking out for my best interest and would never intentionally deceive me, now I have to treat them like every other source of information. I have to look at them just as skeptically as I look at other sources from the world, because these human beings intentionally lifted and deceived their audience. So I understand why that book is no longer in publication, because that was just the tip of the iceberg. There's actually full of quote mines, and by the time I had completed reading that book and got some more feedback from this man I never met, my Bible student's dad, I knew not only was that book illegitimate and deceptive, but they really had no great arguments to refute evolution. If you have good arguments, you don't have to lie and deceive and misquote, and other flaws in that book are it would quote somebody as a biologist or a scientist who really wasn't. There's all kinds of problems with it if you compare it to the source material. And by the time I was done, I was convinced at the age of 13 that there is no supernatural wisdom or insight. In fact, they're not even being honest with their audience. So baptized at 12, by the time I was 13, after having made that lifelong commitment before the bloom of youth, I really wish I would have waited. Because by the time I was 13, I had already realized this is just a human enterprise. And from there, I started looking at every doctrine as potentially being misinterpreted or misread or misquoted or whatever. So, would I have willingly refused a blood transfusion when I know that that is just an interpretation of a scripture taken out of the New Testament, taking it really far, when at the same time there's scriptures in the New Testament that say a woman shouldn't speak in church, and they water that down and say, oh, it just means they can't be instructing. But this is obviously someone's opinion of what's in scripture. Do you really want to stake your life on that? By the time I was 13, I knew that whether I was part of an organization that was the truth or not, the truth wasn't emanating from a superior source, because they were just as deceptive as people in the world. So I'm getting pretty close to 36 minutes here. So yeah, that's the rundown of when I saw the light. Mosquitos, and then the creation book, and then the authors, you could see very clearly in black and white that they are just as dishonest as everybody else trying to make points in the world. So I think I'll leave it there for now, but that was really the genesis of my exodus. See, you train up a boy and it sticks in your head. The genesis of my exodus was their own literature, their creation book. And thanks for everybody who made it to the end of this. We'll talk to you later.